Mr. Ziegler, would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, my name is Bryce Ziegler. First name spelled Bryce, last name spelled Ziegler.
And how are you employed, sir?
I am currently employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation within the Laboratory Division, and specifically I'm a forensic examiner in the Firearms Toolmarks Unit.
How long have you been employed by the FBI lab?
Since 2011.
And what is a forensic examiner in the firearms unit?
So essentially, my main duties are to receive evidence that's relevant to my discipline, perform the requested forensic examinations on those items of evidence, issue my results in a formal laboratory report, and testify to those findings if requested.
And those essentially are your duties as a forensics examiner?
That's correct.
What is your educational background, Mr. Ziegler?
I received a Bachelor of Science in Forensic Science from the Pennsylvania State University.
And did you go work for the FBI after obtaining your degree?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you receive any specialized training to become a firearms examiner?
Yes, so I had to complete what's called the Forensic Examiner Training Program. And that training program is for all forensic examiners at the FBI lab, but it's specific to the unit that that person is seeking a qualification in. So I had to complete that program in order to be considered a qualified examiner.
And how long was that program?
It took me a little over 3 years.
And since completing that program, do you continue to obtain educational classes and continuing education?
Sure, there are some continuing education requirements, and there's also proficiency testing that I must continue to do as well.
And after you finished the initial training, did you then receive on-the-job training as well?
I would say that on-the-job training really occurs during the training program. So I'm working with qualified examiners. I had a mentor that I worked with. I actually worked cases while in a training status, but all my work would be reviewed by a qualified examiner. So I'd say that that on-the-job type training occurs prior to the qualification.
Does the FBI lab have protocols and standard procedures as it relates to firearm exams and firearm analysis?
Yes, we do.
And is there a standard protocol for each test that you conduct in the firearms unit?
Yes, there is. Some of the examinations are combined into a single protocol. Others have their own independent protocols.
And do you follow those procedures when you're doing your firearms examinations?
I do.
Approximately, in your career with the FBI, approximately how many firearms have you examined?
I would estimate that number to easily be in the thousands of firearms.
Let's talk about your examination of the evidence revolver in this case, and we'll refer to it as the evidence revolver. Were you asked to examine and conduct tests on the evidence revolver in this case?
I was, yes.
And who asked you to conduct these exams?
Right, so typically evidence is submitted to the FBI lab from a special agent. So in this case, that person was Jose Cortez. So he submitted evidence to the laboratory, and essentially that evidence comes with a request, a written request on what the contributor would like done.
And what was your understanding about whether or not this was an FBI request or was it a local law enforcement request?
It was my understanding that it was a local case. However, sometimes locals come to the FBI to ask for assistance.
And is that routine?
It does happen. I'd say it's fairly frequent.
What were you initially asked to do as it relates to this firearm?
So specifically with the firearm, I was mainly just asked to assess its function. So that includes things like, are the safeties working correctly? Do I notice anything about the firearm that I may determine that I feel it may be unsafe to fire? So things like blockages in the barrel, bulges in the barrel, potential weak points within the firearm. So things along those lines.
And is part of that function test also doing a test firing of the firearm?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And who did you receive this firearm from in your particular unit?
So when evidence at the laboratory is transferred from one unit to another, it gets dropped off in my unit at a secure storage location. So That's a location that it's badge access only. So people have to have the proper badge access to in order to pick up those items. And then once it's dropped off in our unit, we receive a notification, and either myself or a technician will retrieve those items from that location to begin either taking notes or conduct the actual examination.
Do you recall when you received the evidence revolver?
I do have my notes. I'd have to refer to that.
If you would please refresh your memory with your notes and then let us know when your memory is refreshed.
Yes, so I can tell you that the exams, and when I say the exams, I'm talking about initial documentation. So just things like photographs, annotating the make, model, caliber, things of that nature. They began in April of 2022.
I'm going to show you what's been previously marked and admitted by stipulation as State's Exhibit 3. Do you recognize that, Mr. Ziegler? If you can scroll up a little bit.
Yes, I do.
What is it?
So this is a case notes worksheet. It's a firearms function worksheet. So this is exactly what I was describing to you before. When a firearm comes to my unit, it typically gets photographed, and then some of that kind of background information, make, model, caliber, things of that nature are recorded on this standardized document.
And the photograph that's depicted on Exhibit 3, is that the evidence revolver we've been talking about?
Yes, that's correct.
And does that photograph accurately depict the way that that evidence revolver looked when it was received in your unit?
Yes, yes, it does.
Was there anything about that evidence revolver when you received it in your unit that indicated to you that it may not be working properly or malfunctioning, or that internal components were modified?
No, not in the condition it was received.
And you testified that you did an initial inspection of the gun?
That's correct.
And upon doing that inspection, did you note any defects or alterations on the gun?
No, that initial inspection is basically a safety inspection. And as you pointed out, if I notice anything odd about the firearm or something that may give me cause for concern that it may be unsafe to fire. So I didn't see anything of that nature, so I felt it was safe to fire. So at that point, we did the test firing.
So that was your next step in the process, was the test fire?
That's correct.
Can you describe the test fire for the court, please?
Yes, so I can take this firearm to one of two locations at the FBI laboratory. We have a 25-yard range, and we also have what's called a water tank, which allows me to retrieve fired bullets. So it's a large metal box filled with water. You shoot into the port, it takes away the energy of the bullet, and I can collect the bullet if I need to do so. So I took this particular firearm to the water tank, and I used laboratory ammunition. I loaded it in the way it's designed to be loaded. And while I do this, I'm checking the positions of the hammer. I'm ensuring the safeties are operating correctly. I'm assessing if the internal parts, so things like the trigger connection with the hammer, if those internal operations appear to be functioning normally. And after all of those things, I would actually physically fire the gun.
Before we get to your test fire, you said that you checked the position of the hammer. Did you do that in this case?
Yes.
And can you explain how many positions that hammer has?
This hammer has a total of 4 positions.
Can you describe what each one is?
So in its most uncocked or at rest state, that's when the hammer is fully forward. It's as far forward as it can be, and it's essentially resting up against the frame of the gun. Now, as you start to cock the hammer, there are notches, and you can't see them in this picture, they're on the inside. But there are notches in this hammer that as you cock it, the rear portion of the trigger, which is called the sear, you can hear it click into those positions. So if I have my hammer at rest and I start to cock it, I'm going to hear the first click. That notch is called the quarter cock. Sometimes it's also referred to as the safety notch. If I continue to cock it further, you'll hear a second click. That's the sear dropping into the half cock notch, which is sometimes referred to as the loading notch. And if I pull it fully to the rear, I'll hear a third click, and that's where the sear is sitting in the sear notch. At this point, that is the position where this firearm would be ready to fire if the trigger's pulled.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 4. Do you recognize what's depicted on 4?
Yes, I do.
And what is it?
These are photographs that I took depicting the 4 hammer positions that I just described to you. So you see how far it gets cocked back in each position from the side view, which is the column on the left, and from the top down, which is the column on the right.
Okay. When the hammer was in the full cock position, did you experience at any point that the gun discharged without the pull of the trigger?
No, so when the hammer's in the fully cocked position, as I mentioned before, the sear is sitting in that final notch. So essentially, for this hammer to fall, that sear has to move out of the way. So however that is achieved, that's what has to happen. Now, if this firearm was, as you mentioned, there was an issue where the hammer was falling just on its own, if you look at the bottom 2 photographs here, this hammer is currently in the full cock position. I'm not holding it with my finger. My hands are nowhere near this firearm. So it's sitting in that full cock position on its own. So it has proper engagement. It's not falling by itself. And again, this is how it was received. I wasn't noticing any of those types of failures in the condition it was received.
Can you explain how this revolver fires as opposed to, for example, a semi-automatic?
Sure. So a semi-automatic does a lot of the work that the shooter has to do for you. So it's automatically going to extract, eject the fired cartridge case, chamber the next available cartridge, and then essentially the shooter just has to pull the trigger a second time. With a firearm like this is called a single action revolver. Single action refers to the shooter must manually cock the hammer each time they intend to fire. So there are other types of revolvers called double action where the shooter does not have to manually cock the hammer. They can pull the trigger and it performs that action of cocking and releasing the hammer. However, in a single action revolver, the shooter has to perform that one action manually.
And what position does the hammer have to be in order for it to fire or the trigger to be pulled and it fires?
Right, so this firearm is designed to fire with the hammer in the fully cocked position. So the bottom images that you see here.
You also testified that you inspected the trigger connection with the hammer.
Yes.
Did you find any defaults or any problems with the trigger connection?
All right, so just to be clear, I did not disassemble the firearm prior to test firing it, so I don't have any visual type of indicators of whether there was an issue there or not. However, if there was an issue, I would have expected to see that during the test firing. So whether the hammer would not stay in the full cock position, whether it would be falling on its own, I would have expected to see something if there was some type of malfunction with that connection.
And do you need to disassemble a firearm to determine whether it functions as it's designed or properly?
No, not necessarily. If I go through essentially all the steps to check the safeties, check to make sure the action appears to be functioning correctly, and I physically test fire it, and I don't see any abnormalities that occur during that test firing, then no, there's no reason for me to then disassemble it if nothing odd has happened during that test firing.
And how many times did you test fire this revolver?
I test fired this particular one 12 times.
And during each one of those 12 times, did you observe any of these issues that you just mentioned that would cause you concern that maybe this gun could malfunction?
No, there was nothing odd or abnormal about this during the initial test firing.
And when you did the test firing, did you check the different hammer cocking positions?
Yes, I did.
And at any point during each one of those 12 test fires, did the gun discharge by itself without a pull of the trigger?
No.
And you testified that you checked the hammer's quarter cock hammer position, right?
That's correct.
Did the firearm fire when it was in the quarter cock hammer position?
So that portion of the testing I did during the later phase of accidental discharge testing. When I say that I checked the quarter and the half cock positions, those positions are designed so that if you are cocking the hammer, and if I cock it past the quarter cock notch, and if my thumb slips off the hammer, that quarter cock is meant to catch the hammer before it falls and makes contact with the cartridge. So when I say that I checked those positions during the function assessment, what I mean is I pulled the hammer past those notches, released it, and ensured that that safety mechanism was actually working correctly. So I did that for both the quarter and the half cock positions.
And were the safety mechanisms working correctly?
Yes, they were.
When you had the hammer in the full cock position, did it hold in that position until you pulled the trigger?
During the initial test firing, yes.
What were you able to determine after you conducted your physical examination of the gun, the examination of the trigger of the hammer, and the 12 test fires? What did you determine?
So the end result in relationship to the function exam is just that it functioned normally. And again, that means I didn't see anything abnormal, odd. There were no apparent either damage or modifications that would have rendered this firearm unsafe.
Would you say it functioned as designed?
Yes, it functioned normally as it's designed.
And what does that mean when one uses the term function as designed?
It's basically what I just described. So while I'm conducting my checks of the firearm and physically test firing it, nothing out of the ordinary happened during that testing. So if I had a discharge without pulling the trigger, or if I noticed that the sear notch was not engaging properly, that's something that is out of the ordinary. So that would not be functioning normally, and that's something that I would have annotated in my notes and the report. So I wasn't seeing any of those things. So that's what function normally means.
And as part of your examination, did you also conduct measurements of the trigger pull?
I did.
And what is that? What is that intended to measure?
So in my laboratory, when I do a trigger pull examination, it is not to determine the exact amount of force that is required to pull the trigger. My laboratory, it is designed to establish a range. So at the lower end of that range, I'm confident that that is not enough force to pull the trigger. And at the upper end of that range, I'm confident that essentially that amount of force or weight will cause that trigger to pull every time that I test it.
And how did you conduct this trigger pull test?
So essentially, if you picture a wire coat hanger, so I have a long wire with a hook on the top, and I would orient the firearm vertically, so the muzzle will be pointing straight up at the ceiling. I would hook this, essentially the coat hanger portion of the hook, inside the trigger guard, resting on the trigger, and then I add static weights to the bottom of that wire. And so I can continue to add weights until I reach the point where it's starting to pull the trigger as I pick up on the firearm. So the amount of weight that's added, that's going to be the amount of force that's required to pull the trigger.
And what amount of force was required to pull the trigger for this evidence revolver?
So in my note taking and during my exam, I measured that amount of force to be between 2 and 2.5 pounds.
And what does that mean?
Can you elaborate?
Well, does it mean that it would take 2 to 2.5 pounds of force to pull that trigger?
Somewhere in between those values, yes.
Would that be considered what people call a hair trigger?
I personally would not consider that to be a hair trigger. When I think of a hair trigger, I think of either very high performance hunting rifles, things of that nature, where the amount of force on the trigger, I don't have a specific number for you, but it's extremely light, where you just barely have to touch the trigger to fire the firearm. It's typically you see them in hunting rifles.
Did this particular revolver fire at any point with less than 2 pounds of pressure on that trigger based on your exam?
Right. So I can't answer that question because I don't know the exact amount of force that I'm using while I'm doing the actual test firing. I can just tell you that when I did the measurement with the static weight set as I described, it would not it would not pull with less than 2 pounds of pressure.
When you were conducting the trigger pull measurements, was there any indication to you as a forensic examiner that this trigger had been altered?
No, there was no indication. I feel this range is very common for this style of firearm.
When you're doing the trigger pull measurements, do you also engage the hammer?
Right. So in order to test that, the hammer would have to be in the fully cocked position because that's how this firearm is designed to fire.
And so in the fully cocked position, the amount of pressure during your measurements that it took to fire this gun was between 2 to 2.5 pounds?
That is correct.
Did, after you conducted your physical exam of the gun, the trigger, the hammer, and your test fire. Was another test conducted on this firearm?
Yeah, so I did do some other exams with the ammunition, but if we're focusing specifically on the firearm, the next test is what's called accidental discharge.
Before we get to the accidental discharge test, were the exams that you just testified about, were those conducted according to FBI procedures and protocols?
Yes, they were.
So what is an accidental discharge test?
So in my laboratory, the accidental discharge test, it seeks to determine if I impart a certain amount of force to this firearm, is it even possible for this firearm to fire without pulling the trigger? And the way it's done in my laboratory is essentially I would take a rawhide mallet and I would strike the firearm on 6 planes. And when I'm referring to those 6 planes, if you pictured a cardboard box sitting in front of you, the 6 planes would be the front of the box, the rear of the box, the left side, right side, top, and bottom of the box. So those are the 6 planes. And essentially when I'm striking this firearm with a rawhide mallet, the goal is to determine is this amount of force, this vibration, this shock, is that enough to cause the inner workings of the firearm to disengage and actually allow the hammer to fall and fire the shot. So this test is really designed to mimic if the firearm's been either banged into something or maybe hit with an object or maybe even dropped or something of that nature. Some type of force has been introduced to this gun.
Now, before we get to your accidental discharge test that you conducted in this case, did you document, photograph the condition of the firearm before the accidental discharge test?
Yes, so all the photos that you've seen so far were prior to that test.
And prior to the accidental discharge test, did you have any indication that this revolver was altered or modified in any way?
There was nothing that jumped out at me now.
So once you got to the point of accidental discharge test was the next test that you were going to conduct, did you contact the local law enforcement?
I contacted the special agent Cortez, the case agent.
And was it your idea or did you suggest that there was this test available?
Yes, I did.
Now, to your knowledge, have other firearms examiners at the FBI lab conducted the accidental discharge test in other casework?
Yes, I've seen them do it while I've been in training.
Now, is there a procedure and protocol that the FBI has in place for conducting the accidental discharge test?
Yes, there is.
Did you receive authorization to go forward with the accidental discharge test?
I did from the case agent, yes.
Now, can you describe for the court how you did the test in this particular case, where you had the firearm and how you went ahead and conducted the test?
Sure. So to actually do this examination, I use what's called a remote firing platform. And essentially, you could think of that as a padded vise designed specifically to hold firearms. So it essentially has a vise, but it kind of has rubber on the inside. And I clamped this firearm into that device. And then I continued with the testing as I previously described, striking with a rawhide mallet on 6 different planes. And I also wanted to test this firearm in all 4 positions of the hammer. So I wanted to exhaust all efforts for any condition that hammer could have been in.
Now, was the rawhide mallet that you used, was that affixed to another device or were you using that freehand?
No, that was me physically holding it.
Now, can you describe, if you could use your hands and demonstrate to the court how you applied the force with the mallet, the force to the gun with the mallet?
All right, so it would depend on which of the 6 planes that I was working with at that time. So I don't know if I could give you one description that would encompass all 6 of those planes, but I would liken it to similar to hitting a nail with a hammer, something to that effect.
And were all those in a straight line or could some of those come in at an angle?
Right. So I'm a human being, so there's a good chance that there's going to be some variability in each of those strikes. So sure, it's certainly possible that not all of them were completely perpendicular to the firearm.
And when you're doing the accidental discharge test, did this revolver discharge when the hammer was in the quarter cock position?
So because of the design of this firearm, in the 2 intermediate settings, the quarter and the half cock, I did not have to do the striking with the mallet test.
So was your test then done with the hammer and the full cock?
Yes, I did. I did the striking with the hammer at rest and in the fully cocked position.
At rest, did it discharge?
It did.
And when the hammer was in the fully cocked position, did it discharge?
So I did have one event where it discharged with the hammer in the full cocked position. And what occurred is I struck the hammer directly with the rawhide mallet and the hammer fell. And when we do this testing, I use a primed cartridge case. So I remove the bullet from the cartridge, I dump out the powder. So it's just a case with a primer in it. So that's obviously done for safety purposes. So I'm not firing a shot if there is a firing event. And then I can audibly hear if the primer is detonated. So I struck the hammer fell and detonated the primer during this one event. And what was interesting to me is I thought it was odd that the quarter or the half cock safety notches did not catch the sear as the hammer was falling. So this led me to believe that there was some type of damage that occurred during that event.
But you had to apply a good amount of force for it to discharge, is that right?
Right. I can't quantify what the force was.
Now, was the discharge with the hammer in the resting position, did you expect that? Was that something that was expected?
Yes, this is a known issue with a revolver of this design. In fact, if you would read the owner's manual for this type of firearm, you would see warnings not to carry this firearm with the hammer at rest on a loaded chamber.
So can you describe what eventually happened as a result of this accidental discharge test?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I had some suspicion that something occurred inside that allowed this hammer to fall that was not normal. So eventually, after this testing, I took the firearm apart and I was able to find two locations that had actually fractured during that striking event. It's my opinion that the firearm would not have fired unless those two pieces fractured like they did.
Were you able to fire the firearm after these pieces fractured?
No, it was no longer operable in that condition.
Now, let me go back just briefly to when you offered this test to local law enforcement. What did you tell them about the possibilities of what could happen during this accidental discharge test?
All right, so this is actually written in our standard operating procedures. This test is considered potentially destructive. So in order to do this test, I need to inform the contributor that I may be imparting some damage to this firearm in doing so, and that it potentially may not be operable as a result of that testing. So I had to explain that to the contributor and allow them to make an informed decision.
Now, did you tell them they would definitively break the gun or just that it could potentially break the gun?
No, it's a possibility. There's no way that I could have known for certain that the firearm was going to break.
And when you conducted this accidental discharge test, did you do it according to FBI protocols and procedures?
Yes, I did.
Now, Mr. Ziegler, let me ask you, so even assuming that maybe some internal component of this revolver was modified before you received it in the lab, did the gun fire without a pull of the trigger before you got to that accidental discharge test that broke the gun eventually?
That did not occur during my testing at the lab, no.
At any point before the accidental discharge test, did that gun fire without a pull of the trigger?
Not during my testing.
Was there any indication that the gun did not function as designed before the accidental discharge test?
No, there was nothing odd or noteworthy about this firearm.
As a forensics examiner for the FBI lab, have you had experiences in the past when conducting your scientific testing, evidence you've examined has been either modified in the process of the exam?
Sure, that can happen.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So one example could be if I'm asked to do microscopic comparisons on, say, a fired bullet, and there's also ammunition that's sent in with the case. And I'm initially I would do test fires with laboratory ammunition. However, sometimes it's best as far as how fired ammunition components are marked. Typically, the best ammunition that you have is going to be the closest to what was used in the actual shooting event. So there may be times where the ammunition from the laboratory is just not reproducing the same as the ammunition in the case. So I may reach out to the case agent and request their permission to consume some of the evidence ammunition to collect additional test fires. So I need their permission to do that because I'm permanently changing those items of evidence. I'm taking a live cartridge, I'm physically shooting them, so I'm detonating the primer, I'm consuming the powder, and I'm forever changing the bullet and the fired cartridge case. So they've submitted ammunition, but they're going to receive a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case in return. So that's just one example where, I may be permanently changing the evidence to do my examination, and I would need their permission in order to do so.
Did you conduct this accidental discharge test to damage this gun?
That's not the goal of the test, no.
May I have a moment, Your Honor, just to review my notes? Now, just one last question, Mr. Ziegler. The damage, let me show you what's been previously marked. I believe it's State's Exhibit 5. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 5?
Yes, I do.
And what are they, or what is it?
All right, so this is rotated 90 degrees, but this is a photograph that I took, and this was after the accidental discharge testing, after I disassembled it, and this is depicting the parts in the condition after that test, and it's depicting the two locations that I found where portions of these parts actually fractured off.
Now, prior to the accidental discharge test, did you have any reason to believe that these parts were in this condition as we see them on Exhibit 5?
No, if they were in this condition, I would not have expected to function correctly.
Are these pieces still available, the ones depicted on Exhibit 5? I mean, or when they left your lab?
Right. I returned everything, it in the correct packaging and all that. So as far as I'm aware, yes.
I have nothing further. Thank you, Mr. Ziegler. I pass the witness.
Cross-exam.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Ziegler.
Good afternoon.
When you have this case on your desk, you have your case file and your comms log. Those are the two large packets of documents that you provided. Is that fair to say?
The one is called the 1A. That's essentially the document repository, but that includes the comm log.
Understood. And that includes the request for lab examination. Fair?
That's true.
And any other information that you get about the case, you traditionally get from the customer, the person requesting the testing. Fair?
That's typically the way it works, yes.
Wait, did they provide you, they meaning the Santa Fe Police Department or the prosecutors, any additional specifics about replicating what had occurred in real life when you performed these tests?
No, sir.
What about from the media? Did you learn anything about what happened ostensibly before you performed these tests?
The only thing that I was aware of was that the defendant was stating that they did not pull the trigger. I don't know any of the specifics surrounding that event.
Exactly right. And the reason that you went forward with the testing that ended up destroying the gun wasn't to test for malfunctions, right? It was to verify whether the firearm would go off without him pressing the trigger. True?
So my exam is specific to the firearm, not necessarily the defendant and their actions. So my exam is just to determine what are the capabilities of this firearm. Is it possible for this firearm to discharge without pulling the trigger?
Right. So what you were testing for, though, just to be clear, because this word malfunction keeps getting thrown around, what you're testing for is whether or not the firearm will function without pressing the trigger. Fair?
Specifically for the accidental discharge, yes, that is the goal.
Right. And the reason you have to do that is because the physical exam that you spent some time describing and the little test where you just shoot it 12 times in the lab into the water or whatnot, that doesn't answer that question, does it?
Which question is that exactly?
The question of whether the gun is able to fire without pressing the trigger.
Right. Again, I can only tell you about the results of my testing. So initially it functioned normally, and then the accidental discharge testing beyond that.
Sure, but you wouldn't have suggested and ultimately performed a test that led to the destruction of the firearm if the physical exam and the functional 12 shots into the water were sufficient to answer that question, would you have?
That's a question that's up to the case agent. So I can provide them the information. I could tell them we have the capability to do this examination, but they are the ones that need to make that determination.
The risks of malfunction, I take it that this expression, you're talking about manufacturing effects, modifications of the weapon, or any other damage that could have occurred inside the weapon because of an accident or a drop. Is that what you mean when you say malfunction?
Oh, it could be a variety of things. It could be age. It could be the firearm hasn't been taken care of, so it's rusted and corroded. It could have been laying in the bottom of a lake for the past year. So I know nothing about the history of this gun. So while I'm doing those initial inspections and I'm doing that initial test firing, when I speak about malfunctions, that's what I'm speaking of.
And so when you look at the gun from the outside, you can't always identify if the gun has something wrong with it, can you?
Not visually, no.
Right. And neither could a random actor on a movie set, right? They would have no way to know
Objection.
by looking at a gun, right?
So-
That you're aware of.
Objection, speculation.
Can
If you want to
anyone,
rephrase it, okay, thank you.
is it possible to know just by physically looking at a gun whether or not it's capable of malfunctioning?
I would say no.
And even if you've test fired in your laboratory in the little water bucket a bunch of times in that sort of stabilized environment, just because that works and there's not a catastrophic explosion of the gun or something like that, that doesn't mean that it's impossible that there's a malfunction, does it?
That's correct. I can only tell you that it functioned normally during my testing.
And you didn't at that point, before you went into the accidental testing that led to the destruction of the firearm, you didn't disassemble and look at the inside of the gun, did you?
No, at that point, there was no reason for me to do so.
Well, nobody asked you to.
That's correct, but I also did not see anything that would give me cause to do so.
And not only did you not disassemble it, but you obviously didn't disassemble it and take photographs or video of the inside, true?
Prior to the accidental discharge testing?
Right.
That's correct. I did not do that.
And you have disassembled very similar single action revolvers in your career, have you not?
Yes,
You didn't videotape any of the testing that you have discussed here today, correct?
that's correct. We do not videotape our examinations.
Nor did anybody ask you to videotape your examination, true?
Not in this case.
And I take it the way that you're able to recount what you're telling this court is because you took notes and you have worksheets that wrote down what you did and when you did it. Is that fair?
As well as the standard operating procedures, but yes, you are correct.
Well, but there's different points in this case where you weren't sure whether you did the function test and then sought permission from the state prosecutors to hit the gun with the mallet, or whether you waited to do all of the testing until you got permission. Isn't that fair that you're not sure about the order of this?
No, I disagree with that.
You're quite confident that you did the visual and functional test before asking for permission before they asked you to do the accidental discharge test. Is that your testimony?
I see your question.
Yeah.
No, I can't tell you exactly when I did the function test, if that was before or after that conversation. However, it was before the accidental discharge test.
Right. So I just want to make sure that you are correct. That's what I was getting at. I just want to make sure that's clear to the court that despite your worksheets and the best of your memory, you don't actually know at what point you asked, or rather they asked you to perform the accidental discharge test. True?
I do have messages in my comm log for the dates that I had those conversations.
Right. But you don't, but as you just testified to about a minute ago, you don't know the order of what occurred when, as you sit here, do you?
You specifically asked me if I knew if I function tested it prior to that conversation. So my answer to that is no, but I do know the order that I conducted the examinations in.
Sure. I know that you conducted the functional test prior to the accidental discharge test, because after the accidental discharge test, the gun wouldn't function. Fair?
True.
Now, and the way you do keep track of this, even though you don't obviously know the exact order compared to the phone call with the prosecutors and the detective, or any law enforcement interaction you had, is you take notes as you're doing this. Is that fair?
That's correct.
And you take in the thousands of exams that you've done. You're a note taker. Fair?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. We have standardized note sheets that have mandatory fields that I have to populate.
And in all of those examinations, the thousands you've done, the almost decade you've had at the lab, have you ever performed this test on a firearm?
In a actual case,
In an actual case?
this is the first time, first and only.
First and only. And the firearm cannot be tested now in the condition that it came to you in. Fair?
Not in the condition that as a result of my testing. That's true.
And it's not just, you've also said, by the way, that this examination and the report were fairly complex. Is that fair?
I'm not sure where you're getting that from.
Well, I'm asking you. We can refresh your memory, but I'm asking you, was the examination report here fairly complex?
You wouldn't see the word complex anywhere in my report.
Not in your report, but what about in an email transmitting your report? Saying that sorry for the delays with the report. this was fairly complex?
I would have to see that message.
Do you dispute that the examination and the report were fairly complex?
I'm not sure what you're referring to because that could be speaking to the entirety of the evidence in the case, which was almost 200 items. So yes, I would agree that is a complex case.
The information we've discussed so far, you mentioned on direct examination that there's a manual that comes with this firearm, right?
That's correct.
And this concept of the firearm going off without pressing the trigger is something that's actually discussed in the manual of the firearm. True?
As far as I'm aware, that circumstance is only in that manual with the hammer in one particular setting.
Sure. Thank you for that clarification. But it is true that the manual discusses that this firearm can go off without pulling the trigger. True?
Specifically with the hammer at rest, you're correct.
And you've said this isn't some phenomenon. This is something that's known about the design of these firearms. True?
With the hammer at rest, you're correct.
And well, in the owner's manual also says that a blow to the hammer resulting from a fall dropping of the gun can also cause the gun to discharge. True?
With the hammer at rest, you're correct.
Or if the hammer slips from the shooter's thumb, right?
I would have to see that line to see what that is referring to.
The manual also says that the person should not even touch the trigger because of this concern and sensitivity of the hammer falling. True?
I would attribute that to general firearms safety.
But it's in this manual. True?
I don't specifically know
Objection
that.
calls for speculation. And if he's referring to the manual, I'd ask that he give Mr. Ziegler an opportunity to review the manual.
I'm not required to do that in a cross-examination. He said he reviewed the manual. I'm asking if he knows that.
What was the question that she's saying is speculation?
I guess that I just asked him, does the manual say that don't even touch the trigger because the hammer can slip in this firearm? Does the manual say that? Do you know that?
Answer.
Yes, but you're assuming that he remembers. So
If he doesn't remember, I understand that he may not
All right.
remember it. It's in his report and it's in the manual. So I'm just asking.
All right. Thank you.
I do not know that the answer to that.
If the trigger is held in while you're cocking it and the hammer falls, that can set off this firearm. Isn't that true?
Depending on how far the hammer is cocked, because you have to keep in mind as you're cocking the hammer, the cylinder starts to rotate. So again, depending on the position of the cylinder, if the hammer falls and does not make contact with the primer, it won't fire. However, you are correct. If I hold the trigger in and I cock the hammer and I let it go, you may fire a cartridge in that method.
And the manual says from your own experience that you shouldn't load every single chamber on one of these revolvers because it's at risk. Fair?
And that is referring to the hammer being at rest on a loaded chamber. Yes.
Now, I understand you keep saying that, Mr. Ziegler. Were you prepped on that point before you testified here today?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
I'm allowed to ask a witness what their preparation was on a topic. Were you prepped on that topic before today, Mr. Ziegler?
No, sir. I keep reiterating that because you appear to be insinuating that this firearm can fire with a hammer in every position, and you're using direct quotes from the owner's manual when those quotes refer to a specific hammer setting.
So you weren't, well, I'm asking you a different question now, which is, were you prepped on the issue of whether or not this gun could fire without pulling the trigger before today?
We certainly had trial prep.
Mechanism that we're describing, which you obviously can describe more artfully than me, is not the same on every modern firearm. Not every modern firearm can go off like what we're describing. True?
That is correct.
And there's actually examples of firearms similar to this firearm, right? And you've said you've disassembled very similar single action revolvers before, that if the sear was defective, the gun could accidentally discharge. True?
That depends on many factors.
Sure. I'm just simply asking you, is it possible that if a sear is defective on one of these firearms, it could accidentally discharge? Is that possible?
It is possible, but there are also safety mechanisms within the firearm to include this firearm that would prevent that from happening.
And I'm assuming that there's a caveat on all of these answers, but I'm asking just simply, assuming all other caveats, is it possible that, for example, that if the main spring on this firearm was loose, or there's a loose screw, it could accidentally discharge?
I don't agree with the example you just used.
What about if the notches are worn?
That is a possibility.
And we talked about, or you talked, I guess, on direct about the trigger pull. And just to make sure it's clear, at least in my mind in the courts, the trigger and the hammer, they interlock so that if one is moving, it has an impact on the other. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. The hammer has notches and the trigger sits within those notches. So as the hammer's being cocked, the trigger is moving within those notches.
And you would agree that the trigger weight on this firearm was on the low end of the range of trigger pulls. Fair?
Amongst all firearms?
Amongst all firearms, amongst all single action revolvers, whatever denominator you want to use.
As I testified previously that I feel this range is in line with this type of firearm. Now, if you compare that to a double action firearm or some completely different firearm, then sure, it is lower than what other firearms are.
Well, let's go to that easier example of a double action revolver, which is what many police departments use. Is that fair?
I don't believe many people use revolvers anymore.
Well, is a double action revolver a firearm that would take 10 to 15 pounds of pull force?
Yes, I agree with those numbers.
And isn't it true that the FBI's own website indicates that the standard trigger pull on a single action revolver is 4 to 6 pounds?
I do not know that.
Well, while we're continuing this exam, we can pull up and see if it won't refresh your memory. But if it was 4 to 6 pounds, that would be double or triple the pull force required on the gun you examined in this case. True?
It would be approximately double, yes.
And the pull, the amount of trigger pull weight required, you don't know the genesis of that. Assume for the sake of this question that the trigger pull weight was lower on this weapon. You don't know how that occurred, right? You don't know whether that was the manufacturing or somebody altering it and customizing it. True?
Can you rephrase that question? I don't quite understand that.
Sure. While I'm doing that, if we can just show Defense Exhibit 2, just to refresh your recollection to the witness. Are you familiar with this?
I have not seen this before.
Well, maybe because we could. Are you familiar with the National Institute of Justice, Advancing Justice Through Science Institute?
Yes.
And if you look down at trigger pull measurements and you look at the single action revolver, do you see that under typical trigger pulls, it indicates 4 to 6 pounds?
I do see that.
Do you think that that is a fair number and characterization?
Generally speaking, for single action in general, I would say it's typically between about 2 and 5 pounds.
So you're saying that you disagree with this
To me,
estimate?
there are many types of single action revolvers. So it is my testimony that this type of revolver I feel is in line with the 2 to 2.5 pound force that I measured.
Did you measure the distance that the trigger has to move?
I did not.
Do you know the distance that the trigger has to move in this firearm?
No, sir, I do not.
Now, when you do the accidental discharge testing, the goal of that test is to simulate the firearm in a way as if it was bumped or banged into something. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And if you have the ability, the accidental discharge test should replicate the real world situation as closely as possible, right?
So the accidental discharge test, how we do it at my laboratory, it is lined out in the SOP. And then beyond that, if there is some type of extenuating circumstance that the examiner feels they also need to test, they could then go and do that. However, this is the way that I did it, the method that I use, that's what our SOP dictates.
Well, when you say dictates, it also provides the examiner some discretion as in regards to how that is believed to have occurred in the real world, doesn't it?
Again, this is at my laboratory following my SOP. That line, I believe, follows the accidental discharge testing. So it's written as in if there is any additional testing that the examiner feels that they should do.
Right. So, and you've testified previously that if I had a gun leaning against a door and I'm saying that the door opened and the firearm fell, I would try to replicate that situation. Haven't you said that?
That was in regards to, I was being asked about a drop test.
Well, if you knew that that's how a firearm had gone off in your discretion, wouldn't you have tried to replicate that test?
That's a conversation that I would have with the case agent.
But you didn't do that in this case, did you?
I received none of that background information, so no, I did not.
But as you did this test, you had no reason to believe that the prop gun on the movie set had been hit with a hammer, did you? You didn't think that that was the real world, correct?
No, sir. I explained the
you-
test.
Right. And you also didn't believe that the gun had been dropped and fired after being dropped, did you?
I had no background knowledge.
And there was no reason provided to you by Santa Fe Police Department why you couldn't do, for example, a push-off test prior to the destructive testing. Nobody gave you a reason why you couldn't do that. True?
That's true. That did not come up in conversation.
And again, just like on your emails to them, your email address, your phone number is there, and you were having communications throughout this case with both Santa Fe Police Department and the liaison, Special Agent Cortez. True?
Special Agent Cortez was my main point of contact. However, yes, there were some email chains where the detectives were also included on them.
And when you do conduct the test that ends up leading to the gun breaking, what you're trying to see is if the amount of shock or vibration that's being introduced to the firearm is enough energy on that particular firearm to cause it to fire without touching the trigger. Fair?
That's correct.
And you knew from your experience, the manual, the light trigger pull, you didn't think it was impossible that the test would come back showing that this gun was capable of an accidental discharge without a pull, right? If it was impossible for this to happen, you wouldn't have done a test that jeopardized the weapon, would you have?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. It's not so much as whether I think it's possible or not. It's just, is there an investigative question, and do I have an examination that can assist in answering that question?
Right. But if on the one hand, right, there's no possible value to this test, and on the other hand, the test was going to lead to a likely damaging of the firearm, you wouldn't have conducted the test, would you have? You wouldn't have recommended the test.
That was not my decision.
And did you consider any other tests, like the push test, before embarking on the test that led to the destruction of the firearm?
Objection asked and answered.
I didn't ask that question before.
Yes, you did. Sustain.
There were 2 times during your testing that this firearm fired without pulling the trigger, as I understand it. Is that fair?
That's correct.
So why don't you just explain those 2 times to the court, the 2 times that it fired without you pressing the trigger in any way?
So the first time was when the hammer was at rest on a loaded chamber, and by striking the hammer with a mallet, that provide a sufficient amount of force for the firing pin to detonate that primer. So this is the same issue we keep talking about in the owner's manual. The hammer being at rest on a loaded chamber is inherently dangerous with this type of firearm. So that was an expected result. The second time was when the hammer was in the fully cocked position and I struck it with a mallet. The internal parts fractured, so that hammer fell and fired the cartridge.
After this testing, I think I understand your worksheet to indicate that you continued testing the firearm at the half-cock notch?
Right. The trigger sear, even though it was broken, it was still engaging at the half-cock notch.
You did it again.
So as I described, I had to test all 6 planes, and I had only tested 5 of those when the breakage of the hammer occurred. So I still felt that if it was possible for me, if it was feasible for me to test that 6th plane, which was the bottom, that I should do that in the condition that I was able to.
And when the Santa Fe Police Department and the prosecutorial team gave you the original directive, they didn't tell you, hey, if something goes wrong as you're testing, if some damage occurs, come back to us, check in with us. They didn't give you any limitation like that. Fair?
I don't recall that occurring, no.
So when there was a little bit of damage done to the firearm, or some damage, if you don't like the phrase little, at that point, you did not do anything other than continue to strike the firearm again with a mallet. Fair?
The damage that you're referring to, those internal parts had already fractured at that point.
Well, do you think that the final mallet strike might have done further damage?
Not necessarily.
Well, I know not necessarily, Mr. Ziegler, but it's possible that it did, is it not?
It is
Objection
possible.
asked and answered.
That's that question either. Isn't it possible, Mr. Ziegler, that the following 6th hammer strike caused additional damage?
I should answer? Yes, that is possible.
When you were striking it with the hammer, you gave some testimony that you could have hit it not straight on, diagonally. Do you remember that testimony you gave on direct?
Yes, just me being a human being, there is a potential that there's some variation there.
But it's fair to say you were trying to hit it straight on in the various planes as indicated in the SOP. Fair?
I was following the SOP. It doesn't necessarily dictate it has to be at exactly 90 degrees for each of those blows. So I followed it to the best of my ability.
But you weren't intentionally striking it diagonally, were you?
Not necessarily, no.
In your amended report, you removed the phrase with a pull of the trigger, with a pull of trigger.
That's correct.
Can you just explain to me why you removed the phrase with a pull of trigger?
Right, so that statement is in regards to the testing I did with the hammer in the quarter and half cock notches. And as I previously spoke about, the design of this firearm allowed me to test the gun with the hammer in those two positions without doing the strikes. So I could test those two positions by actually pulling the trigger, allowing the hammer to fall, and seeing if it was even feasible for the hammer to fire the cartridge in that position. So I actually tested it by pulling the trigger. And in my report, I mistakenly wrote that I tested it without a pull of the trigger. So the end result was the same. It still did not fire, but I felt the description of the process was inaccurate.
And who brought that issue to your attention?
I actually found that issue when I was in preparation for a previous trial.
You broke the gun. That's when you take it apart for the first time. Fair?
Yes,
And there were several parts internally of the gun that were damaged and broken.
that's correct.
And you don't know if the gun had any internal damage before you did the test, correct?
I can't verify that. I can just tell you that it had no effect on the function of it when I received it.
And you don't know if the gun had been modified before you ran that test, correct?
That's true. I do not.
You also noticed that the full cock notch was flatter than the other two notches, fair?
Yes, I did.
It didn't have as much of a claw shape to it, correct?
That is correct.
And you have no way to compare the condition of the prop gun now to the condition before the test, do you?
That's correct. I cannot.
And even after performing the test, you don't know whether it's possible for the gun to have fired without the trigger being pulled, correct?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. You can't say, as you sit here, whether or not it was possible for that gun to have fired without the trigger being pulled.
Right. So I can only testify about my exams. So my results, how it performed in my laboratory.
And you know that outside experts can't examine this firearm in the condition you got it in, correct?
Right. It would be different than the condition that I originally received it.
And you also know, well, let me ask you this. As you looked at the state's Exhibit 5, the broken pieces of the gun, you don't even know for sure that you got every single fragment of the broken firearm as you transferred it on, do you?
That is possible. We're talking about very small pieces of metal, very thin pieces of metal. So yes, it's certainly possible they could have fallen out of the gun at the time. They could have fallen out in transport. Again, these are very tiny pieces. So you're correct. It is possible that I was not able to account for everything.
And even under the best of circumstances, you did this in the lab. You can't account when you're doing these tests for every variable that might occur in the real world on a movie set, right?
That's fair, I would say, yes.
How did you inform Detective Hancock of the breaking of the firearm?
I don't specifically recall that.
And from the moment of the destruction of the firearm in 2022, April of 2022, were you ever asked to do any further tests in 2022, 2023, 2024?
In regards to the firearm,
Yes.
there was never nothing was ever submitted. There was never a formal request, no.
And were you ever asked during that period of time to meet with any other firearm expert in this case, or speak with any other firearm expert in this case,
No, sir.
even up until today?
I did have a pretrial where another firearms expert was present. I didn't consult with them regarding my examinations.
You just happened to be sitting in the same room during the pretrial?
No, it was virtual.
You just happened to be sitting in the same virtual room during the pretrial?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, you said you weren't consulting with them. What were you doing sitting in the same room with them?
It was preparation for trial, and I believe the prosecution team chose to have individuals there to, I guess, see if what I was saying made sense to other people who had experience with firearms.
And that was the first time they asked to do that in all of 2022, 2023, and 2024 was the first time they asked to do that was this week?
No, sir.
Was this week the first time that you were in a room discussing the facts of this case with another expert witness? Yes or no?
Oh, another expert witness? Yes, that was the only time.
And so I think I won't ask it again. I think it's clear. And
Sorry, I thought you said another examiner. That's where my confusion was.
I apologize if it was my fault. That individual that you met with, who was that? I understand it was virtual. I understand you're not calling it a consultation, but while you and another expert witness on this case were in the same virtual room together, who was that other expert witness?
Right. This was a preparation, a pretrial, and it was Mr. Haag,
Who else was present during that?
Miss Johnson, and Miss Morrissey.
Anybody else?
Also, a representative from my laboratory, OGC, Office of General Counsel.
I see. Ever in any of the thousands of guns that you've ever tested, have you ever had a pretrial meeting with another expert and the prosecutors and somebody from the FBI General Counsel's office all present in a meeting? Has that ever happened before?
To the best of my recollection, no.
And what did you all talk about?
It was essentially preparing for this testimony here.
Can you give me a little bit more information?
General trial prep, going over my results, how this process is going to unfold. This is the first time I've done a hearing like this.
Do you have any notes from that meeting?
I did not take notes.
Did you speak to anybody else after the meeting about the meeting?
Probably just some coworkers. That would be it.
Your supervisor?
I share a lab suite with my supervisor, so yes, he was aware of that the meeting occurred.
And was this the meeting, and now from meeting with the state's expert, Lucian Haag, that he believes there to have been no purpose for this test, right? You know that, don't
I
you?
understand.
I'm sorry, objection. He's asking him to comment on what another witness believes. I think that's improper, and it's also calling for Mr. Ziegler to speculate.
I'm asking if that came, if you know that from having met with him. I'm not the one that put them together 3 days before his testimony for the first time in 3 years.
What was the question?
The question is just that it goes to his state of mind, and it goes to what happened at that meeting 3 days before his testimony and his preparation, that he has been informed that that other expert believes that there was no beneficial purpose to the test that he performed.
No beneficial purpose to the test that Mr. Ziegler performed?
Correct.
All right, I'll allow that question.
Yes, I'm aware that is his opinion.
And you're aware from that meeting that Mr. Haag had issued a report that indicated that he thought that this firearm had been modified in some way outside of the FBI lab. True?
I am aware he's authored a report. I do not know, I haven't read that report, so I don't know the content of that report.
But you understood in that preparatory meeting that that report was an issue that you all needed to discuss. Fair?
I'm aware that he saw marks that he was trying to figure out how to explain. Again, I don't know the content of his report. I don't know what his conclusion was.
Well, you were aware that you were being called in to try to give Mr. Haag more information to deal with the issue of this report. True?
That wasn't necessarily the purpose of that meeting. That is something that occurred as a byproduct of that meeting.
Well, but you didn't need to have that meeting before you testified at Hannah Gutierrez-Reed's trial, did you?
I did not have that meeting.
Right? No prosecutor told you before this trial, we really need to have this meeting with another expert. That's never happened before in your career, right? Nobody said that.
No, but it is customary to have a pretrial meeting with the prosecutor, which this is what that was.
But it's not only unprecedented, it's not only unusual, but it has never happened in your entire career that at such a pretrial meeting, another expert is present asking questions and bringing up issues about the report that they authored. True?
Objection, Your Honor. That question contains facts, not in evidence, and it assumes speculation. It's asking Mr. Ziegler to speculate on what this other expert believed or what he opined. He's already said he has not read that report.
Overruled.
At the transcript and you looked at the questions, I think it's a natural follow-up question.
Can you repeat your question, please?
I will do my best. I don't have a real-time transcript, so I will do my best. What I'm asking you is, I understand that it is common to have pretrial preparation with prosecutors. I believe you've already testified that never before in your career have you been brought in to have a pretrial interview where another expert is present asking questions about their report. True?
That's correct.
And you knew, you called it a byproduct of that meeting. One of the topics of importance at this meeting was the report that Mr. Haag issued, in which you understood generally he did not think it was your mallet hammering that caused the modification of the firearm. You knew that, and you discussed that at that meeting, sir. True?
Your question is partially incorrect.
Well, why don't you tell me what's correct, and then you can tell me what's incorrect.
So you posed that question as though I knew that's what the purpose of this meeting was. I did not know he was going to be a participant in this meeting until the meeting occurred. So no, I didn't know that was going to be a topic of conversation.
And once you were at the meeting, it became a topic of conversation, correct?
That is correct.
And this is the first time withdrawn. And you understood from this conversation that the questions being posed to you were trying to elicit information that helped explain Mr. Haag's report, which was in sum and substance that the FBI was not how the firearm got modified, but rather that the gun was modified by somebody other than the FBI. You understood that, right?
I can't testify to Mr. Haag's intent or what his goal was.
But can you understand? I'm asking what you understood, sir. You understood that part of what occurred at that meeting was trying to understand, right? At that meeting, did you demonstrate how you use the mallet?
He asked me a series of questions to gain an understanding of how I conducted that test.
Including a demonstration of how you use the mallet?
I don't believe I physically held my arm up into the air, but I explained it just as I did here today, that I would liken it to in a similar fashion to hitting a nail with a hammer, something to that effect.
And a nail with a hammer, you're trying to hit straight, right?
I suppose so.
And you had his report, what he found so unusual and why he thought the gun was modified by something other than your test was because the lines were diagonal. True?
He did mention that.
And that is when the testimony, that is the first time that anyone posed to you in this entire case for 3 years, well, couldn't you have hit the firearm diagonally, right?
That is the first time I was asked that, yes.
I have no further questions for this witness at this time.
Redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor, thank you. Mr. Ziegler, did the Sheriff's Department initially request the accidental discharge test when they requested testing of this gun?
No, they did not.
Now, as the FBI lab, is it your practice to learn the facts of a case before you conduct any sort of scientific testing?
No, not necessarily. When evidence is submitted, it's typically submitted with a written request. We call that an EC, or an electronic communication. And sometimes that request has background information, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the person who is authoring that request. But it's not something I would go and seek out. And most times I would typically prefer to have less information. I'm just asked to examine the evidence, not necessarily take into account external information.
So it's your practice as a scientist to have less information because you want to focus on the evidence. Would that be accurate?
Yes, I believe that's true.
So if this particular gun was able to fire without pulling the trigger, would that have been something that you would have noticed during the exam before the accidental discharge test?
Sure. If it was doing that during my function evaluation, yes, I definitely would have noticed that.
Now, Mr. Spiro asked you questions about why you suggested the accidental discharge test. Were you concerned that this gun fired without a pull of the trigger, and is that why you suggested this test?
It's not something that I detected. It's that I had been made aware that statements were being made in national news that the trigger was not pulled. So I felt I had a duty to inform the case agent, this is a test, we have a capability to conduct this examination, explain the test, explain the caveats, and then leave it up to them to decide if they want to pursue that test or not.
Now, you were asked some questions about disassembling this gun. Why didn't you disassemble the gun before the accidental discharge test?
As I've stated before, there was nothing abnormal or out of the ordinary during my function evaluation and test firing. So if something was occurring, if the hammer was falling, or if otherwise maybe the cylinder wasn't aligned, if something was occurring to where this gun was not functioning normally, then yes, I would have wanted to take that apart to try to figure out what was causing this. But because nothing like that happened, I had no reason to disassemble it.
Now, do you always, or is it protocol or SOP for the FBI for you to videotape your exams?
No,
And in this case, you were asked about the sequence of the testing. Was the accidental discharge test the last test you conducted?
on the firearm, yes.
Yes, on the firearm, that's what I'm referring to. Now, you were also asked about the use of the word complex. Was the exam on the firearm, just the firearm, a complex exam?
Not necessarily. I would say it's routine. And again, for each of these exams, I followed my standard operating procedures. So pertaining to just the firearms exam, as far as the function and those sorts of things, those are fairly routine. So no, I wouldn't necessarily consider that to be complex.
Now, you were asked some questions about the manual for this particular revolver. Does the manual say that the gun can fire without a pull of the trigger if the hammer is in the full cock position?
Not that I'm aware of.
Now, you were asked some questions about the trigger pull and whether or not the trigger pull measurements you obtained were in line with this type of single action revolver. Are they in line with this type of firearm?
Yes, in my opinion, they are.
Now, even if this gun, assuming, let's assume for a minute the defense position, even if this gun had been modified when you received it in the lab, would you have had problems, or did you have any problems firing it?
I did not have any problems. So even if the hypothesis is true that, let's say hypothetically, this gun was modified in some fashion, it had no effect on its function in the condition that I received it.
Did it have any effect on the full cock hammer holding without a pull of the trigger?
Not in the condition I received it, no.
Now, you were asked some questions about this meeting where Mr. Haag was present. Did you explain to Mr. Haag how you conducted the accidental discharge test?
Yes.
Now, as an expert witness, is it unusual to discuss or talk to other experts?
As I've stated before, it's not something that I've done in the past, so I don't feel I can really answer if it's typical or not.
To your knowledge, other FBI examiners, have they discussed their results with other experts, even within the FBI?
Sure, definitely within the unit. There might be things that come up that you may want someone's opinion on, something of that nature.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
I have nothing further. Thank you, Mr. Ziegler.
Thank you.